All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. We have a few housekeeping things before we get started. We ask that you keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will be happy to address them at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. And we'll be monitoring those comments and answering questions at the end of the program. Please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted on our social media channels once the talk is over. And if you would like to rewatch this talk or any previous talks, you can visit our Facebook page. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Miss Karen Helmerson, who's going to give an incredible lecture today. And with that, I will hand it over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I just want to put a little plug in for Tiffany, because without Tiffany, these talks really wouldn't take place, because she is doing all the PowerPoint, setting up the PowerPoints for me, which is very time consuming, laborious endeavor, and very helpful to me. So welcome to Neoclassicism to Impressionism in France. I'm stopping at Impressionism because it's such a rich and varied century that it would be a little bit too much to include the next phase, the post-impressionists. So that will be my next talk next month in May. So if you enjoyed this one and you want to see what happens with the post-impressionists, please join in. So this is a very interesting century. We're actually going to start at the very tail end of the 18th century. And at that time, the Rococo was sort of the popular movement that celebrated the aristocracy and the ancien regime. Well, what happens in the 19th century? We are at the axis of revolution, the French Revolution, which is somewhat guided by the American Revolution. We also have later in this century, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1871. So there's war, there's revolution, there's the Industrial Revolution that begins in 1810 and moves on through about 1870. So France is going through many changes. It is also the century of isms. And if you think about it, we have Neoclassicism, we have Romanticism, realism, the Barbizon painters, which is a segue into Impressionism, and then post-impressionism. So it's a very almost, I don't know if I just use the term easy, but it's rather interesting to see how these clusters of artists carry through these different movements in France. Now, if you have visited France, most of you probably have, you will notice that so many of the paintings that I am going to show you are from two museums, the Louvre and Musée d'Orsay. So frequently you will have seen these paintings, and also they are very important to the history of art. So I will keep this bar at the Folies Bergère by Monet, a very, very important and famous painting. And I'll just go through a few more things about France at this time, and then we will be able to see some of the artists. So the revolution in France begins about 1789 and runs to the latter part of the 1790s. At that time, at the end, we have the ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte. Who was in power? Well, it was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Now, I want to make a little disclaimer. In the some of the information that was published for you to access this this talk, it said Louis XVII. That was just that was an error. I apologize. Louis XVII did live 2 years past his father, but without great acclaim. Why was there a revolution in France? Well, there's a couple things that were happening. We have the Enlightenment. René Descartes, 1687, begins the movement of French Enlightenment, separation of church and state, giving less power to these very strong overseers, as it were. People were tired of this ancien regime in the estate system. They did not like this form of absolutism. There was the Enlightenment, there were food shortages, and there was the American Revolution. So that kind of helped propel what happens in France. In terms of the arts, we have the Royal Academic overseers, we have the salons. France and England had a system of academic strength, and they really guided how paintings were shown, what paintings were shown, how people became famous, how you made money, and they're very tightly controlled. And the salons established themselves as the purveyors of culture and wisdom and money. The upper classes and the upper bourgeois would sort of dictate who would see these paintings, what paintings would be shown. At the time of Jacques-Louis David, and I'm going to move on to him. Excuse me, I missed one of the paintings. At the time of Jacques-Louis David, who was the preeminent artist in France at the time of the Revolution and afterward, the academies were very strong, and he was sort of the overseer of the academy, which is actually very interesting because he was a revolutionary. And you will see that in the next painting, The Death of Marat, that he was a very active revolutionary. He was such a brilliant artist that he was able to paint around the time of the Revolution, before the Revolution, and after Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were guillotined. So because of his enormous skill, Napoleon said, we're going to keep this artist on. He's just too talented. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about Jacques-Louis David. He was a principal proponent of Neoclassicism. What was Neoclassicism? Okay, so there in art, throughout the ages, there's always this sort of cause and effect. For example, in the mid-20th century, we had abstract expressionism, which often was abstract art. What happens after that? We begin to see figuration return. And this is kind of the same give and take and change of styles. There was the very Rococo, pastel colors, the aristocracy, the fête galants, all these things that really documented the upper classes. Well, Jacques-Louis David was influenced by an art historian named Winkelmann, who had started to look at ancient Greece and Rome. He started Jacques-Louis David as a Rococo artist. He studied very briefly with Boucher. However, he did not take to that style, and he studied with a man named Vien, V-I-E-N. And Vien was a history painter, Joseph Marie Vien. He was a little sentimental, a little overly sugary, but he did have this neoclassical style where the line was very prominent, and philosophies on art and society were very different. David was a member of the Jacobin revolutionary group. He actually worked a bit with Robespierre, and he encouraged other revolutionary activities. He had this theme of martyrdom and devotion to the state. At one point, because of his revolutionary activities, Jacques-Louis David was actually jailed, but he did come out of it. He wasn't guillotined as some of the others were, like Robespierre, for example. So let's look at probably his most important painting. It was done 4 years before the French Revolution, and it focuses on antiquity, and again, the writing of Winkelmann. It's derived from a Roman legend from about 669 before Christian era, and it talks about this dispute from Rome and also Alba Longa, so two regions. And Rome is represented by the Horatii, which is on the left. You do not see the Curatii, who are their enemies. And the interesting story goes is that it was decided that instead of mass injury and death in a battle, that 3 members of each group of the Horatii and the Curatii only 3 members of each group would fight, and they would show allegiance to the state. So you see 3 of the Roman soldiers saluting the father and saying, yes, we will go to battle. And the father hands out these 3 swords. You see on the right, weeping women. Why are the women weeping? They're heartbroken because they know that they've intermarried. So these 2 forces have intermarried. And so some of them have married members of each group, and they know that they will lose probably members of their family. As it were, everyone dies except for the man with the red and white. And one woman actually the sister survives and tells her brother, you killed my husband. You killed my husband from Alba Longa. And you horrible Roman people. And the brother tells her, too bad, I honor Roman, and slays her. So it's kind of a dramatic and very awful story, but it's set in a very classical sense. So what do I mean by that? When you look at a neoclassical work, you see very fine lines, and it's more like that geometric way of painting. You look at these Doric capitals in this archway, Doric being those flat capitals, not scrolled Ionic or Corinthian. And you see it's rather austere. The light falls on the floor and the faces of the men, and it's very upright. And there's just this very smoothness about it, almost like glass if you look at the floor. So it's an allegory of loyalty. It incorporates neoclassical themes from Greco-Roman themes and Greek philosophy, and it shows how we follow and honor the state. So it was a very important painting. But one of my favorite paintings, and it's one of the few in this whole collection that is not in the Louvre in d'Orsay, it's actually in Belgium, and it's The Death of Marat. This is an amazing painting. It shows Marat, who was a revolutionary, a very extreme revolutionary journalist, and he's in his bath. Now, you might say, if you don't know too much about the painting, it's a very interesting story because he suffered from an extreme skin condition. So Marat was almost always soaking in a bath to calm this horrendous skin affliction. But when you look at it, it's almost like Michelangelo's Pietà, this flailing arms, this exquisite, almost sculptural style. You do not see any of the imperfections, though. David does not focus your eyes on the imperfections, but what you do see is the slice where he's been stabbed by his shoulder and the blood dripping down, and then you see the knife as it lies on below his back. It's a very tragic painting. He was murdered because of his radical beliefs, but he was murdered by a woman named Charlotte Corday. And Charlotte Corday was rather upper class, and she represented a different sort of aspect of the revolution. And she felt that Marat was too extreme. And so she writes a letter of introduction. And you see that he holds that letter of introduction in his hands. And you can even see Corday, Marat. And she lies to him and tells him, I think there's some espionage going on that you might want to know about. So I am going to ask for an audience with you. And so Marat allows her to come in. And of course, she stabs him. And then she's later jailed and murdered, or killed, I should say. But let's again look at this Caravaggio-esque light as it falls on the body. It's very religious. As I mentioned earlier, it reminds us of Jesus and martyrdom. 4 years after this painting was done, there was the storming of the Bastille, and we really have sort of the culmination of the French Revolution. It shows the horror of martyrdom, and it's this beautiful figurative element to it. You can see on his rough writing table his signature and David to Marat. And then David's signature, you see the inkwell and the plume as he's writing. But it really shows in such an exquisite way what a martyr would go through. So we have our last David painting I want to show you is from our own Timken Museum of Art. And it's a portrait of Cooper Penrose. Now, this was done after the revolution, and I told you that Jacques-Louis David was so acclaimed that if you had money, you want this artist to paint your portrait. So this is in our very own Timken collection, and it shows Cooper Penrose, who was a Quaker, but he was a very wealthy Quaker. I believe he was in the cloth business, and he came from Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, and he wanted the preeminent portrait painter to capture him. But he is somewhat of a modest man, and because he's Quaker, he does not want to show a lot of attributes of his wealth. And now in art, you know that attributes are objects that show something about the particular person. So for example, if he wanted to show something about his great wealth, you might see him holding something, you know, but here we don't have that. We have a triangular formation from head down to shoulder and hands, and it's in the lower register of the painting, which makes it more interesting because it shows a more humble depiction. He's not at the very top filling up the whole canvas. He is on a lower register. And if you talk to artists, you know that the hardest thing to paint are hands. But you also know that faces are very difficult. And in this case, there is so much attention being made to the beautiful hands of Cooper Penrose and that very intelligent face. The details of the chair with the nails and probably velvet, the carved arms, this exquisite suit of clothing, the linen he's wearing, the very fine jacket, that would probably say his wealth, and also the fine furniture and the fact that he'd have to have some money to have his portrait done. So Cooper Penrose shows the immense skill of Jacques-Louis David. Now, I am going to talk about Theodore Gericault, but I want to kind of put a little disclaimer, and I'm going to go ahead for just a moment, if you'll allow me, because really, I went back and forth. Should I show Ingres? Because Ingres is a classicist too, not sort of a different classicist. And I also many times when I'm putting these together, I think about chronology. But suffice to say, there is a romantic nature in the work of Ingres. So Romanticism, sort of this crossover. So if you're a little bit wondering why I did Gericault, it's just because there is so much in the crossover of Ingres. So I'm going to start here with Gericault. And Theodore Gericault did not live a long life. He died in his 30s. He had gone to England toward the end of his life, and he was very unwell. So if he had been able to live a long life, it would be amazing what he could depict, because he was a brilliant artist. They called him the pioneer of Romanticism. He loved drama. He loved horses. Now, if you looked at the previous images by Jacques-Louis David, you could see a much different structure to the painting. The color is more subdued, tonalities of light brown and green. Here we have this dramatic, the reds and the bit of yellow, and you see the painting, and I'm not sure if my cursor does it, but this is on the diagonal. If you want to think about what Romanticism portrays, it portrays dramatic subject matter, many times exotic subject matter. The colors are more profound. The diagonal increases tension and movement. There is so much movement in this painting. You did not see that with the previous painting. This is a more static. I'm going to go back for a moment. Look how static this painting is, comparatively speaking. And I'm not making a value judgment. Stylistically, they're so different. You can see that. But it does tell us that we have moved into a different form of art and brushstrokes. Also, there's a lot of exploration, I should say, or travel to foreign places. So artists at this time are looking at people and culture in Africa, in North Africa, in Asia, and they're bringing back ideas. And in this case, this is a profoundly interesting story. So back to Gericault just a bit. He was from Rouen, France. He trained in Paris. Most of the artists I'm showing you did have some training in Paris. Many of them tried to show at the Salon. They tried to receive the Prix de Rome. And I did forget to tell you that Jacques-Louis David did go with Vian to Rome when he received the Prix de Rome, and he studied the classics, and he studied Renaissance artists, Baroque artists. So going to Rome, winning the Prix de Rome, or traveling to other countries to look at other artists, and also going to the Louvre to paint was really important to these painters. So Gericault was really influenced by military art. He loved Rubens. He loved and also the Renaissance. Rubens, of course, Baroque. He went to the Louvre and painted. But he became captivated by this horrible story. So this is a true story, based on a true story. So in 1816, a ship from France going to Senegal with soldiers to colonize capsized. Well, it ran aground. Well, why did that happen? Well, there was a captain from the Ancien Regime who was given this ability to captain a ship when he hadn't captained a ship in 20 years. He should never have been sailing. So he runs the ship aground, and we have a horrible situation. We have 150 individuals, men and young boys, well, young men, I should say, and there are not enough lifeboats. So 150 men are clamoring to save their own lives. Sadly, they couldn't get lifeboats together, and only 10 men survived. And this represents one of the lifeboats that tries to stay afloat. And there is so much in this painting. First of all, we have this African-American soldier, and he is signaling, please help, help. And in the very far distance, and I don't know if my cursor is working down here, but there is a boat that is supposed to be helping them, and they don't see the raft and they sail off. So can you imagine the horror? Also, something that was very awful, bloody and sort of terrifying was there was cannibalism, because they stayed afloat for a number of days. And so cannibalism did occur, very gruesome. You also see dead bodies, like sculpture. You see people dying. You see this man, he holds his dying son. You see bodies covered in blood. They've fallen on each other. They're fighting to stay alive. It's a very, very horrible situation. And what makes it so terribly interesting and amazing to me is that, you know, Gericault had read some newspaper accounts of what happened, and he said, I have to document this. So he interviewed 2 survivors of 10, and he went to the morgues, and he looked at not just survivors, of course, that wasn't really the case. It was just, he looked at cadavers, and he began to look at their anatomy. And so there is such physical reality here. Look how the light, that kind of Caravaggio-esque light, falls on these writhing bodies, and the musculature, the three-dimensionality, the movement, it's incredible. So this is one of the most important early paintings of Romanticism. So now we will go to Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Sorry, this is always my little problem. What are we looking at here? We are looking at the work of a champion of Neoclassicism. Ingres was an amazing draftsperson. And like Degas, who comes later, Degas and Ingres basically had this theory that drawing looks easy until you do it. And that, I believe, was attributed to Monet. But you could say the same thing, to Degas, but you could say the same thing about Ingres, because line was very important to him, but he also was a brilliant colorist. So he studied at the Royal Academy, and he moved to Paris, and he studied with Jacques-Louis David. So Jacques-Louis David was his mentor. He loved antiquity. Like Jacques-Louis David, he won the Prix de Rome at his was in 1801, and he lived in Italy for a while. He loved the work of artists such as Raphael, and he became a classicist. So it was a little slightly different than what Jacques-Louis David was doing, because his form of classicism was a little unique. So let's talk about this particular painting. This is a segue between classicism and Romanticism. Why is that? We'll look at the exquisite line and draftsmanship that he employs. But the subject matter is very romantic, because as I mentioned earlier, there is this interest in faraway places. And this happens to be a concubine from a sultan's, let's say, sultan's palace. And of course, Ingres had looked at the work of Venus of Urbino, originally attributed to Giorgione, but of course Titian, a Renaissance Venetian artist. So the sister of Napoleon Bonaparte actually commissioned this painting, and she had been interested in this subject. So we have a beautiful concubine, and she looks at us with such direct gaze, very unusual posturing. But something else, and I wish, unfortunately, when we have a live audience, it's so much easier to do a sort of Socratic question and answering. So I would want to ask you, what do you see that's unusual about this odalisque? And you can say, I'm sure you would respond, look at her elongated vertebrae. I mean, there is actually 2 extra vertebrae in her neck. And also the different lengths of the arms. The right arm is a different length than the left. So her body is the supine posture, but it's rather elongated. Now, I'm going to mention some theories about this, and I hope it's not a little inappropriate, so I apologize, but some would say, in some of the research I did, that her elongated body was because her body was sort of the provenance of the Sultan. So he loved the elongation of her body, gave him, a better pleasure, I guess. So I apologize if that upsets anybody, but that was found in my research. So let's look at other aspects of the painting. This very beautifully crafted, they used to use a term very inappropriate now called orientalizing. That was a term used. We will not use that term, but we'll say that there's this influence from Japan, for example. And also look at these beautiful peacocks. That also comes from the Middle East. So she holds a fan with peacock feathers, and there's peacock feathers used in this exquisite satin drape. There's a sumptuous fur cover here, and she lies on a sort of a chaise lounge. You can see the signature in the lower right foreground of Ong, but look at this beautiful face with the pearls, the bling of that time, and her turban. So most likely a sultan from Turkey, something like that. And then of course you can definitely see this in the Louvre. So it shows the travel that inspired many of these artists. And later when we look at the Barbizon and the Impressionists, we will see that a lot of inspiration comes from Japan. So we will go to another painting by Ong, and this is a rather complicated painting, and it is the apotheosis of Homer, the acknowledgement of the importance of Homer. And he is being crowned by a winged figure, probably Victory, and he's positioned with 44 other very prominent philosophers, thinkers, painters, who honor the legacy of the great writer Homer. In fact, at his feet, there supposedly is a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He also is positioned on a throne before a Greek temple. And we can see the use of Ionic capitals. So again, I'll just remind, Neoclassicism also is in architecture. And if you go to the DC, you will see how Thomas Jefferson was so inspired by the neoclassical architecture we saw in France when he stayed there. And some of the buildings represent that. But neoclassicism, obviously, what just the name implies, it responds to classical antiquity. So just for a little art history review, the Doric capitals are very square and flat, and they were used in very early buildings, but the Ionic were more feminine capitals, and you see that scroll-like configuration. And then eventually farther along, you will see the Corinthian capitals, a much more open floral decorative element. So you see this temple, and with carved aspects to it, and he stands before it. And so what Ong wanted to do is honor people that were influential to him, influential to writers and thinkers. And so someone who was very important to Ong was Raphael. So here, right now, being led by a Greek philosopher in blue is Raphael. And it's really interesting how the more modern, I'm speaking of that time period of the 19th century, this is done in 1827, we see more modern writers and thinkers like Descartes. But as they scroll up, we begin to see the important members of antiquity. So by putting Raphael on the same register as the thinkers of antiquity, he elevates him. He elevates his prominence. But you can see musical instruments and elements of writing and painting. And so this is a very profound homage to thinkers and writers and painters of that time. But look at how beautifully he renders Winged Victory with those exquisite wings going back. And she places the laurel crown on Homer. And so you have to recall too that where did the laurel leaves come from? The laurel leaves were a symbol of Apollo, and he was sort of the god that oversaw creativity, writing, painting. And so she places that laurel crown on the head of Homer. So for time's sake, I am going to move on. But this is, again, this is very symmetrical. If you compared it to what we saw with Gericault, you would say completely different. Post and lentil. Everything is fine lines, and although this is more colorful and dramatic, you do not see that such extreme movement, diagonal color. So we will go on to one of the greatest painters of the 19th century, Eugene Delacroix. Delacroix was probably, they say, related to Talleyrand, the first prime minister of France, and they was said to kind of look like him. Never wholly substantiated, but that just is a theory. So he was one of Eugene Delacroix was one of the most influential artists of the 19th century. He was a brilliant history painter, a leading figure in the Romanticism and that movement. He was passionate about brushstrokes and color. His work was so influential that the Impressionists really looked at his paintings and were inspired. He also liked very exotic subject matter. He did travel, as most of them did. Again, he was so influential that even beyond the Impressionists, the symbolists used some of his work. He loved portraiture, landscape, history painters. He could do it all. If you have a chance to go back to Paris, I would encourage you greatly to go to his home on Saint-Germain-du-Pré in Paris. His home has been established as a museum, and you see where he worked, his inspiration. You can see some of his artwork. I highly recommend it. And he was very successful, so it's a beautiful home. So he had also, by the way, before I forget, a lot of these artists had looked at two very prominent English artists, and that was John Constable and J.M.W. Turner. So you can often see some of the inspiration of these earlier painters, English painters, in the work of, let's say, Delacroix, for example, and then later Monet. So, well, how would you even see Turner in something like this? Well, look at the cloud formations. This is very Turner-esque. There is a semblance of buildings here, and then we have this horrific scene. What is it? Okay, liberty leading the people. There was an uprising in 1830, and the Parisians took to arms. They were tired again of starving, these inequities in the system, these upper classes kind of reigning over the lower classes, the peasants. And so the revolution, even though it begins around, the latter part of the 18th century, it does still continue aspects of the revolution. And in the revolution of 1830, they were trying to overthrow King Charles X. So that was part of it. So back to Delacroix, he was very inspired by Renaissance painters. He loved their color, their use of light and form. And so he wants to show some of their elements in this painting. So we have liberty with the tricolor leading the people. And the color yellow ties so many aspects of this painting together. The young boy with the pistols in his hand. And then we have the yellow pants of not typical revolutionary. I mean, there were revolutionaries who were upper class, but this is an upper class man. So we have what he's saying to us in this painting. It's not just the lower classes that are revolting. It affects everyone. We're united, and the colors unite us. So liberty leads with yellow, the soldiers lead with yellow. We have smoke in the background. We have multitudes of fighters with sabers, with guns, and they're shouting, and we have action and these yellow ties throughout the painting. And it's beautiful, it's energetic, very much romantic. Again, that diagonal, that color, and the fact that he depicts an historical event. So liberty leading the people. Moving on, we will look at an even more romantic painting, and that is The Death of Sardanapalus. So this is the tale that is shown in such vivid detail. And I apologize because I said most are in the Louvre or d'Orsay, but this one is actually in Philadelphia, this version. What is the story about? Well, this was last king, Sardanapalus, last king of Assyria, and he is being threatened by his enemies. And he decides, no, my enemies aren't going to get me. They're coming for me, but I'm going to eliminate everybody that's closely attached to me, and there'll be nothing left. And he was a very interesting figure. He actually dressed in women's clothing and had this whole harem. He was known to be a very cruel and vicious man. He lies on a draped bed, and you actually see some of his concubines dead, hanging over the bed. One of them here on the left, she's already half dressed, and she's dead. And then we have a servant, sort of ironically, delivering a carafe and sipping cup. Maybe you want some refreshments as you watch everybody get killed and then you die. We have a servant here, and he's stabbing himself to death. And we have a horse so tragically being murdered by his handler. We see another servant or soldier pulls a very intricate dagger from its holder, and he's stabbing her to death. And then we have these ironic things, like we have this elephant-headed bed sculpture. We have gold elements here, all of the Assyrian kings, not all, but some of his glitter and objects. And so, but the look at the brushstroke, so painterly, so vivid, so violent in nature, very chaotic. And again, I would ask you if I was able to have a Socratic exchange, who do you think influences Delacroix? And if you look closely, you would probably say Peter Paul Rubens, and of course that is very much the case. And if you want to look at the work of Rubens, please go again to our wonderful Timken, because we actually have a beautiful Rubens, and some of the color, you can actually see this red color, which was very prominent in Rubens' work, and also the work on the diagonal. It's very romantic, it's very theatrical, just like a lot of when we look at the at the Baroque, you will see some of those same elements. But it's gory, it's dramatic, and it proves also this interest in exotic locales and themes. We're going to move on now to another ism. And I'm very taken by the work of Courbet. Courbet was a realist. And we now are moving into the middle of the 19th century. He lived from 1819 to 1877. He was from Ornans. And you can see the title of this painting, The Burial at Ornans, which actually depicts his own family member, his great uncle. But let me just show you a little bit more about him. He championed the realist movement. He wanted to show the honor and, let's say, the sacrifice of the poor and the working classes. He did study in Paris. Again, he also loved to look at the work of Caravaggio and Rubens. He went to the Louvre to paint. He did exhibit in the Paris Salon. And when we get to the Impressionists, I'll tell you a little bit more about the Salon. The Academy was very stronghold on French society, but it diminishes after about 100 years. But these salons continue to exhibit work by artists. And many of these artists I'm showing you did show in different salon groupings. So what are we looking at here? This is an amazing, amazing work. It is slightly political in a very subtle way. I said slightly because it does capture, it moves away from depicting, let's say, an exotic theme, an upper class theme. It shows everyday people mourning. He did not paint actors or let's say models. He painted the people from his village because he was from here. And look at these faces are not glamorous. They look tired. They look like they have dealt with, let's say, adversity in their life. And we see them leaning before where the coffin will be laid. We see the members of the clergy here. And then we also see an homage to Christ with this crucifixion that looms over, that watches us. It's not theatrical. It's very compressed, very realistic. And what another thing that Courbet was, Gustave Courbet was saying is, I am tired of the hierarchy of painting. I am tired of the French Academy establishing that history paintings, paintings of mythology, those are important paintings. No. Depicting everyday people, the real people, is an important aspect of any artist. So we have this sort of muted canvas. And if you compare it to, again, the work of Delacroix, Gericault, it's much more subdued, much more, it's not exactly monochromatic, but we have a lot of blacks and grays and green. So this artist too was very influenced by the 17th century, let's say the Dutch 17th century paintings, and how you have to revere that people who are working to maintain our society, whether they're farming or that sort of thing. So one of the paintings, I'm going to go on, one of the painting that has always fascinated me in my studies of art history is this painting, The Stonebreakers. And if you don't know the story, it's a really tragic story. This incredible painting that actually depicts tragedy in a way was destroyed. What happened? Well, it was being moved in Dresden. It was in Dresden and it was being moved in a transport, and the Allied bombers bombed the transport and the painting did not survive. So this painting is lost to posterity, very tragically. It was painted in 1849. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had written the Communist Manifesto. So he was very influenced by that. And you can see that in his subject matter. So we have two figures. And these two figures, if we look later, the next painting is by Millet, and you will see it's also of people at work, but Millet does more of an aerial perspective. This is crowding of the picture plane again, and you saw that with the previous painting. The only thing that sort of alerts our eyes to some other kind of atmospheric quality is this little bit of blue sky. The little bit of blue sky that's rather lovely does not really take away from what is happening with these two figures. Now, if you think of chain gangs, it's kind of similar to that, because when you break up stone, now we have earth movers and, cats, whatever you want to call them. Here, these people were like on a chain gang. They weren't exactly, but they were breaking stones with rudimentary, like hatchets and axes. So it's very laborious work. We have a man too old to be doing this work, and we have a young boy assisting him who's probably too young. And he holds this very heavy woven basket, and the light falls on the figures. And one thing that Courbet did in his paintings, which is quite different, let's say from Jacques-Louis David, is that he does not concentrate, and many artists, I should say, does not concentrate just on the hands and the faces. He gives total, let's say, unilateral emphasis on every aspect of this painting, whether it's the stones, whether it's the clothing, the light, the creases in the pants, the baskets. Everything is given total weight. It's set against this low hill, and it just shows how much Courbet honored and felt for these everyday people. And of course, that's why we call it realism, because it is real. He probably watched this occur. All right, for time's sake, I will go on to the work of Jean-Francois Millet. Millet was one of the Barbizon school members. He painted in the area in Fontainebleau, a little town called Barbizon, and there's beautiful woods there. But unlike some of the other Barbizon painters, he concentrated more on the farms and the people working in the farm. So he was slightly different. You can definitely see an influence of probably Dutch painting in this particular image. He lived in the Barbizon woods. He died in his 50s. He had, I believe, some tuberculosis, if I'm not mistaken, but he moved to the Barbizon woods because of an outbreak of cholera in Paris. And so he worked with artists like Theodore Rousseau and Diaz de la Peña, also members of the Barbizon school. So who were the Barbizon painters in a general group? They were the predecessors to Impressionism. So we don't just sort of jump from realism and then we go to Impressionism. We begin to see this influence of landscape in art. Now, just to back up just a moment, landscape. When you think about landscape and you think about Poussin in the 17th century Baroque painter, Poussin was painting landscapes without really needing to make it religious or historical. And if you go to our very own Timken Museum, we have a beautiful Poussin landscape, and you can see how he was studied by some of these artists and how they were influenced by him. The Dutch in the 17th century, Van Rysdale, for example, Hobbema, were painting beautiful landscapes. And although there were slightly hidden messages, they were basically landscapes for landscape's sake. When you looked at the work of Giorgione, Venetian Renaissance artist, he too, with the Tempest, for example, was beginning to show landscapes. So let's look at this particular painting. And I do want to make read a quote. So if you bear with me, I'll read from my notes. And the quote was by Millet, and he said, "It is a treating of the commonplace with a feeling of the sublime that gives art its true power." I'm going to repeat that if it's okay with you. Again, it is the treating of the commonplace with the feeling of the sublime that gives art its true power. A very beautiful statement. So here we have three peasant women from somewhat of an aerial perspective, and they look very proud, but they're actually scavengers. So what are gleaners? Gleaners pick the remnants, the detritus of wheat, and they are so poor that they have to just grab the little sheaf, the little bit of wheat that's still on the ground. Of course, they're impoverished. But Millet looked at them like Courbet. He was sympathetic to these people. And if you look in the middle ground to the background of the painting, you will see a much more, let's say, wealthy might not be the term, but a much more affluent group of buildings. You see the hay wagon, you see men on horseback, and they're all supervising the harvest. So these gleaners have to come kind of surreptitiously. They bend over. They know what they're doing is sort of looked down upon. And it is also a very huge painting, monumental painting. And people looked at it and said, you're making this grand gesture to these three graces of poverty. But you know what was really bothering the upper classes when they saw paintings like this? First of all, you're glamorizing in a way, not glamorizing, but you're profiling people in poverty. And what was really disturbing to some of the upper class people is, think about it. The peasants outnumbered the peasants outnumbered the upper classes. So better be careful. I'm going to move on quickly because I want to get to Impressionism and we don't have a lot of time. So I do want to talk about Henri Daumier. And Daumier was a painter and a printmaker. He was he criticized society very successfully. He was known for his caricatures. He satirized society, the politicians who were very corrupt. He was born in Marseille, which was, it had its own kind of issues. Sometimes he was arrested. He was arrested for portraying Louis Philippe as a gigantic, gluttonous figure that was once documented by Rabelais, and Gargantua was the figure by Rabelais. And so Baudelaire loved his work. He called him one of the most important men, not only of the style of caricature, but of modern art. So we have a third-class carriage. He is sympathetic to these people. We have this woman who faces us. She is sort of, they're all kind of collapsing on each other. This woman holds a baby, a little boy. There's no men in this grouping. They're humble. The wealthier people are in the background, more bourgeois. They have finer clothes. These people have tattered clothes. But he puts this exquisite light on these isolated figures, this beautiful light. But you can see the element of line and caricature in this painting. So again, I'm moving a little more quickly because I'm running out of time. Theodore Rousseau was born in Paris of a bourgeois family. He left his family business to become a painter. He exhibited in many salons. I believe there was at least 6. But then he took up a period of time in the Barbizon woods. And he paints this beautiful image of the Barbizon woods in evening. And evening time is more difficult, especially night is more difficult and less frequently done than day paintings. But we see a priest as he goes along to home. We have these majestic trees. The sky is lit up. We've got these autumn leaves, and we see the village of Fontainebleau in the background. And we also see not an idealization of, well, I guess you would say a little bit of a more idealistic version of landscape than we saw with some of the other Barbizon painters. But I do want to go on, and I'm actually just going to talk momentarily about the work of this painting by Corot, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, a very important painter to the 19th century. He lived in France, traveled all over in many different places, spent a lot of time in Italy, quite a bit of time. He would sketch outside, bring it back to his studio. He was a Barbizon painter for a time, but he didn't really see himself strictly as a Barbizon painter. He was very faithful to French classical art, less so to the Dutch and English. He was interested in the Arcadian past, and so you often see elements of that in his painting. I'm just going to point out the topic of this. This is Hagar in the Wilderness, and you can see very monochromatic landscape. Hagar, from the 4 books of biblical paintings that he did. This is where Abraham deals with, well, I'll just read the story. Abraham, because of his wife, Sarah was elderly and barren. A child was born through Isaac and Hagar. So Hagar has been left out to this desert scene, and it's kind of a tragic commentary, but because of our time, I will move on, and I apologize for not giving. Just really quickly, this is in our Timken Museum. This is a view of Volterra. Volterra is a wonderful place to visit. Because of this painting that I study and talk about, I went to Volterra. I had to go. I wanted to see these Etruscan ruins and the Roman ruins that you find in this village. Corot was very interested in these paintings, in these ruins. And so he too depicts this area. I would be remiss if I did not talk about Manet. So I am going to just race through and talk about Manet. He learned to paint from the Louvre. He studied with the old masters, particularly loved the work of the Spanish Baroque like Velázquez. His work was accepted in the Salon. But he was an interesting character. He had a little bit more money and he was acclaimed. But even though in some ways he was very conservative, he was also very modern. And some people would say this particular painting is the beginning of modernism. It's in d'Orsay. It broke away from classical traditions. It shows 4 figures. Now, some of them believe it was from Titian's pastoral concert. There's many elements. It shocked people, and it was featured in the Salon de Refusé in 1864. Very much like Spanish painting in this darkness, very gestural brushstrokes. We have a still life in the foreground, and we have these naked women. Who are these women? It shocked people. Why is a naked woman with these men? And these were actually portraits of family members. I believe it was his brother-in-law. And we don't really know the story. One woman is bathing in this very gestural kind of Barbizon brushstrokes, but this naked woman looks at us. And it was a very, very controversial painting. But he also did the bar at the Folies Bergère. The Folies Bergère was a nightclub, a dance club, a drinking establishment, very popular. And he was dying of syphilis when he did this painting. So Manet was dying. He actually saw this scene, went to his hotel and painted. And Tiffany, I apologize. I see it, my time is running out. If you could just give me a few more minutes, because I want to just show 1 or 2 Impressionist paintings. But this bar at the Folies Bergère is very interesting. It shows his interest in photography, the way he crops the painting. There's still lives here. And when this painting was done 10 years before, there was a Franco-Prussian war. So there was still a lot of hatred for the Germans. We had, unfortunately, because they were at war, we have bottles, but they have British labels on them. We have a Dutch still life, like with the oranges. What does that represent? It represents a vanitas or a memento mori, because he knew he was dying. And if you look at the painting, you see the back of the woman looking at a patron, but it is not, it is actually very difficult to ascertain that she's really not talking to him. So I'm going to move on 2 more minutes. I apologize. We have to look at how the work of Impressionists was named. So Claude Monet was from Le Havre, seaport town. He lived in England for a while. He was sort of the master of Impressionism. He participated in this exhibition, which named the Impressionist movement. Why? He called this Impression Sunrise. It's a harbor in Le Havre. You see sailboats, you see high-mast schooners. He was very much influenced by being in England and seeing the work of Constable and Turner. He names it Impression Sunrise because impressionistic kind of brushstrokes, almost like a drawing. When the critics saw this in the first Impressionist exhibit, Sisley, Degas, other artists were there, they called it this Impressionist, and they looked at it very disdainfully. But suffice to say, the movement took on with this particular painting. I'm sorry, I'm giving short shrift to Monet. I only have a couple more minutes. I don't want to go too far over. But if you've ever visited the gardens of Giverny, you will be so captivated by the last few years of his life, more than a few. He worked in the outside of Vernon is a town. Vernon, outside of Paris, was this home of Giverny, and he was very greatly influenced by the Japanese woodblock prints that were coming into France, and he decided to have a Japanese and in French garden. He had this Japanese drawbridge. He had water lilies. And because of his interest in atmosphere and light and capturing landscape and this envelope of atmosphere that surrounds us when we are in nature, he did what's called plein air painting. And that's what the Impressionists are known for. But not all of the Impressionists were plein air painters. For example, Pissarro, a Jewish-Danish island artist who was one of the older artists who influenced everybody. Look how painterly and gestural this night view of Montmartre. It's a cityscape. So Pissarro, for example, loved to paint the city. It's not topographical, it's atmospheric. And he too was influenced by the English painters. He painted from Montmartre, from a window in Montmartre, and he could look down. He also painted the Crystal Palace. And the Crystal Palace, at the time it was created, was the largest building in all of Europe. And it was made of glass and iron, and it was sort of it was made by Paxton in 1855 for an exhibition. Very famous painting. So he captures people and places, not just the landscape. And lastly, I'm going to just show you the work of Degas, because we only have like a minute or two. And I love the work of Degas. Unfortunately, he was rather an unkind person. He came from the upper classes. We know that because of his name, Day. It originally was Degas, so of, and that is an aristocratic title like von is in German. He was a son of a Parisian banker. He loved to copy the old masters. He went to Italy. He stayed in the Louvre to look. He painted modern life of that time. So he loved horse racing, the ballet, the theater, and he was a founding member of the Impressionists, but he was different from them because he was not a plein air painter. Here we have the ballet class, 1871. And we see Monsieur Perrault, who's a choreographer and dance teacher, standing in the middle. And it's in a very odd angle. Why? Because Degas was interested in drawing, sculpture, and photography. Remember, photography had begun in 1835 with Henry Fox Talbot at Laycock Abbey. And even earlier with Nepis, who was doing what are called heliographs. So photography was moving along. So he paints these young girls, and he has a little watering can in the foreground, a little lap dog and a cello and this beautiful window and light. And some of these girls are one scratching her back, and some of them look a little awkward. And what he claims is, don't worry, eventually these young girls are going to be beautiful and they will become fine dancers. And lastly, I do want to show you this one painting. I beg your pardon. It's the absinthe drinkers. And this is not a sociological commentary of drinking. It just shows, but it does show sort of this trauma of isolation and the horrors of absence. But he's not really making a moralistic judgment. He's just showing what people look like sitting and drinking this rather poisonous alcohol. Beautifully done. And we'll end on the Luncheon of the Boating Party by Renoir, who shows what life is like along the Seine among these artists and writers. And we see Caillebotte and Renoir's fiance and all these art historians and collectors along the Seine with still lifes and landscape and figures. So I'm going to end there because I apologize for you. Many of you had to go over with me, but there's a lot here in 1 century. So Tiffany. Hi, Tiffany. Do we have any questions?
It looks like we don't have any in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or put them into the comment box down below.
And again, I want to put a little plug in. If you are interested in French painting, I will be doing the post-impressionists, and you can see the work of Cézanne, Van Gogh, Seurat, and Gauguin. And I give a whole hour to them because of their influence on modern art, even though as we look back on Monet, we see that modern art does begin earlier in the century.
All right, it looks like we have one comment that says that they'd happily listen to you speak all day.
Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you.
Comment.
Thank you for all of my viewers. I really appreciate you taking the time to study art with me.
Alrighty, and if we don't have any questions, I will say thank you to Karen. That was a really cool and fascinating talk. Oh, looks like we do have a question from Ryan asking, did you visit Monet's garden?
Yes, I did. Was that the whole question, or did they?
Yeah.
Oh, I want to tell I hope if you have a minute, I'll just tell this very funny story. So we took the train from Paris to Vernon, and we disembarked, and we convinced my brother-in-law, who doesn't really like to walk, we're going to walk to Giverny. Well, it was an hour and a half from the town of Vernon. When we got there, it was magnificent. We were rather exhausted, but We spent a couple hours. It was beautiful. But on the way back, it was just too daunting. So we snuck on a tour bus. They didn't even know us. And we got back to Vernon and back to the train. So I always laugh about that story because I was so anxious to get there. And we just jumped off the train and ran to Vernon. But it is exquisite. But you do have to go at special times of the year because you don't want to go when it's too cold. We actually went in early October when it's still, you can still see beautiful flowers. And of course, he did so many of the water lilies, which were aquatic plants. But if you have an opportunity to go back to that area, Paris, it's really worthwhile. Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Do we have anything more?
Well, I'll just say quickly, thank you very much for this lecture. It was wonderful. And I wanted to put in a plug for the Timken exhibition that's going on now with the night watch and the photographer that takes the pictures of the people watching the night watch. And I thoroughly enjoyed that.
I really appreciate you saying that because it is, you know, that artist, Dijkstra, Renate Dijkstra, is the foremost Dutch photographer. I mean, she's in the Tate, she's in the Met, she's in major museums throughout the world. Her art's even on stamps from Holland. She's a lovely person. We had her featured. Maybe you attended that lecture. She talked about her work. And it's very cutting edge too, which I love that we're bringing in contemporary art and how it speaks to historical paintings. And of course, we have that, our beautiful Rembrandt. So thank you for that plug because, you know, we're always doing amazing things at the Timken, from talks, we bring in teachers, we go out into the community, we do so many things. And I mean, that's why I'm so, I'm so passionate about the museum because of all the things we do for art and the community. So thank you for that. And that's a very true statement about the exhibition.
And I think it's there until June 4th or something, right? Or for a little while for people.
Well, it is. Yeah, I believe it is into early June, but thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you.
So Tiffany, are we, any more questions?
So it looks like there's no more questions. So I will say that we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you again, Karen, and thank you everyone who was able to join us today and for the questions. If you would like to know more about any of our upcoming events, please check out our events page on our website. And thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you join us again for our next virtual talk. Have a great day, everyone.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you all. And I will exit.